alien genetics, official academic theology, deeply intertwined with state institutions and supported by massive funding to uphold comfortable, safe doctrines, loves to feed us reassuring myths. We are told, with a confident, almost dismissive tone, that the mysterious Book of Enoch is nothing more than a naive religious apocrypha, an ancient Jewish legend that early church authorities wisely excluded from the biblical canon. Establishment scholars tend to avoid deeper analysis of this text, but independent researchers and alternative historians point to a different interpretation. In this view, the Book of Enoch is not simply a religious narrative, but a detailed account, almost like a log, describing an encounter between early humanity and non-human entities. At first glance, to a modern reader raised on edited versions of history, Enoch is said to have witnessed angels. However, the text itself describes the arrival of approximately 200 beings referred to as the Watchers, or Grigori. According to the narrative, these entities descended to Mount Hermon and directly interacted with humans. In this interpretation, Enoch is not seen as a traditional prophet, but as an observer or recorder, someone documenting the transmission of knowledge. The text attributes specific teachings to these beings. One figure, Azazel, is said to have introduced metallurgy, methods for crafting weapons and tools, while others are described as providing knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, navigation, and natural phenomena. One of the most controversial sections of the text describes interactions between these beings and human women, resulting in the birth of the Nephilim, figures depicted as powerful and destructive. These accounts are often interpreted symbolically, though some alternative perspectives view them as descriptions of early attempts at biological or genetic experimentation. The Book of Enoch was ultimately excluded from most canonical religious texts, though it has survived in certain traditions and manuscripts. Its removal has contributed to ongoing debates about its meaning and significance. Whether viewed as mythology, allegory, or a record of misunderstood events, the text raises fundamental questions about how ancient civilizations understood knowledge, technology, and their place in the universe. Galaxy Map, official academic science firmly barricaded within its sterile, safe, institutional frameworks and supported by massive funding to maintain a simplified narrative of humanity's place in the universe, often presents the idea that Earth is a unique center of life and that all complex texts are products of human authorship. We are told that the Urantia book, published in Chicago in 1955, is simply the result of imaginative or speculative writing. However, alternative interpretations suggest a very different perspective. According to these views, the Urantia book represents an unusual and highly complex body of information whose origin has never been definitively attributed to a single author. Its structure, scale, and internal consistency have led some to propose that it may have been produced through non-traditional means, described metaphorically as a kind of data transmission. At first glance, the text may appear to be an elaborate cosmology, yet it presents a detailed framework describing the structure of a vast universe composed of numerous inhabited worlds. Within its system, Earth, referred to as Urantia and assigned a numerical designation, is portrayed as a relatively minor and peripheral location within a much larger cosmic hierarchy. The book contains extensive discussions of cosmology, philosophy, and the organization of the universe, combining elements of science, metaphysics, and theology. Some readers note that certain concepts described in the text appear advanced or ahead of their time, though such claims remain subject to interpretation. One of the more striking aspects of the narrative is the idea that Earth exists in a form of isolation from a broader network of communication. This condition is explained within the text as the result of an ancient disruption, referred to as the Lucifer Rebellion, which allegedly led to the restriction of interaction between Earth and other parts of the system. Because of its unconventional origin and content, the Urantia book has often been classified outside mainstream academic or religious traditions. It is frequently regarded as a speculative or philosophical work rather than a verified source of historical or scientific information. Nonetheless, it continues to attract attention as a unique example of a large-scale, highly structured text whose origins and implications remain a subject of ongoing discussion and interpretation. Alien Botany, official academic linguistics and cryptography, firmly established within conventional research institutions and supported by significant funding, typically present the Voynich manuscript as an unsolved historical puzzle, often described as a possible hoax, an encoded text, or an example of medieval experimentation with language and symbolism. The prevailing explanation suggests it is a 15th century artifact filled with unknown characters that have resisted full interpretation despite decades of study. It is true that some of the most advanced efforts, from professional cryptographers to modern computational analysis, have not yet produced a universally accepted decoding of the manuscript's language or structure. This has led to a wide range of interpretations, from it being an elaborate cipher to a constructed or artificial language. At first glance, the manuscript appears to be an unusual illustrated book. However, one of its most distinctive features is its detailed visual content. The botanical section, for example, contains drawings of plants that do not clearly correspond to any known species. While some researchers suggest these may be stylized or composite illustrations, others note that their structures do not easily align with known categories of plant morphology. The manuscript also includes astronomical and cosmological diagrams, as well as sections depicting human figures, often in connection with fluid systems, pipes, or symbolic environments. These images have been interpreted in various ways, including as representations of medieval medicine, astrology, or symbolic processes. However, no single explanation has been definitively confirmed. Because of these unresolved elements, the Voynich manuscript remains one of the most enigmatic documents in history. It continues to be studied across multiple disciplines, including linguistics, history, cryptography, and computer science. Rather than being fully understood, it stands as an open question, an artifact that challenges existing frameworks of interpretation and highlights the limits of current knowledge. Entity dictated. Official academic theology and the history of religion, firmly established within conventional academic institutions and supported by substantial funding, often present simplified explanations of controversial texts. We are commonly told that the Book of the Law, Liber al vel legis, by Aleister Crowley, is merely the product of his imagination, variously described as mystical tворчество, psychological experience, or deliberate provocation. However, alternative interpretations focus on the unusual circumstances under which the text was recorded. According to Crowley's own account, the book was written in April 1904 in Cairo, during a series of sessions in which he claimed to receive dictated material from an entity identifying itself as Aiwass. In this view, Crowley did not describe himself as the author in the traditional sense, but rather as a recorder of the content. At first glance, the text may appear poetic, symbolic, or obscure, yet some readers note its structured nature and the consistency of its themes. It introduces a philosophical framework centered around individual will and personal sovereignty, expressed in its most well-known line, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Interpretations of this statement vary widely. In academic and religious contexts, it is often discussed as a form of ethical individualism or a challenge to traditional moral systems. Others see it as a broader philosophical proposition about autonomy and self-determination. Because of its unconventional origin, symbolic language, and provocative ideas, the Book of the Law has remained a subject of debate. It is frequently analyzed within the contexts of mysticism, psychology, and modern esoteric traditions. Rather than being universally accepted in a single framework, the text continues to be interpreted in multiple ways, ranging from a personal spiritual document to a structured philosophical system that challenges established beliefs. Dimensional code, official academic history, and classical linguistics typically present the legacy of John Dee as a mix of genuine scholarship and later life involvement in mystical or esoteric practices. It is often suggested that his work with so-called angelic communication was a product of the intellectual and spiritual climate of the Elizabethan era. However, some alternative interpretations focus on Dee's lesser-known manuscripts, particularly Liber Loagaeth, the Book of the Speech of God. These texts, recorded during his sessions with Edward Kelly, contain highly structured symbolic tables and sequences that have puzzled researchers for centuries. While mainstream scholarship often categorizes them as part of Renaissance occult traditions, their precise structure and internal consistency remain subjects of ongoing study. At first glance, the material appears to be a collection of unfamiliar symbols and linguistic patterns. Yet closer analysis reveals that these tables follow strict organizational rules. The system, often referred to as the Enochian language, differs significantly from known human languages. It incorporates layered patterns that some researchers interpret as having mathematical, phonetic, and spatial properties. Dee himself described the process not as invention, but as reception, recording information conveyed during structured sessions. From a historical perspective, this has been interpreted in various ways, including as a form of early experimental linguistics, symbolic system building, or spiritual practice. To this day, the full structure and purpose of Liber Loagaeth have not been completely decoded. Despite advances in cryptography and computational analysis, no definitive interpretation has been universally accepted. Because of its unusual nature, the manuscript continues to occupy a unique position between history, linguistics, and esoteric studies, raising questions about the limits of interpretation and the nature of symbolic systems that do not fit within conventional frameworks. Crystal Drive, official academic Egyptology, and the conventional history of science generally interpret the Emerald Tablets of Thoth as symbolic or philosophical texts associated with later alchemical traditions. They are typically described as metaphorical writings rather than literal records of advanced knowledge or technology. However, alternative perspectives suggest a different interpretation. In these views, the tablets are considered not merely symbolic, but representations of a highly structured body of knowledge attributed to a legendary figure known as Thoth. Rather than being understood as mythology, some interpret this material as a conceptual framework describing the relationship between different levels of reality. At first glance, the story appears to be a traditional account of an ancient Egyptian deity associated with wisdom. Yet, some interpretations emphasize the unusual descriptions of the tablets themselves, often portrayed as being made from a durable, unknown material and designed to preserve information indefinitely. One of the most frequently cited principles from the text is the idea that, as above, so below. In academic contexts, this is usually treated as a philosophical or symbolic statement. However, other interpretations frame it as a concept describing structural symmetry between micro and macro-level systems, an idea that has parallels in certain areas of modern physics and systems theory. Because the original form of the tablets has never been definitively verified, much of the discussion remains speculative. What persists is their influence as a conceptual framework that continues to inspire interpretations related to the nature of reality, knowledge, and the relationship between different scales of existence. Optical cipher. In mainstream academic scholarship, the stanzas of Dzyan are generally regarded as part of the work of Helena Blavatsky, presented within the Secret Doctrine as a translation or reconstruction of ancient teachings. They are typically interpreted as philosophical or esoteric literature rather than literal historical records. At a surface level, the text appears to describe cosmology, creation, and cycles of existence using symbolic and abstract language. Scholars often analyze it within the context of comparative religion, mythology, and 19th century esoteric thought. However, some alternative interpretations suggest that the stanzas may represent a highly structured symbolic system rather than purely literary content. In these views, the language referred to as Senzar is described not as a conventional human language, but as a conceptual or symbolic framework that encodes information in a non-linear way. Descriptions of Senzar sometimes portray it as a system where meaning depends on multiple layers, visual, geometric, and contextual, rather than fixed alphabetic symbols. This has led some researchers to compare it to abstract information systems or multidimensional symbolic representations. There are also interpretations suggesting that such texts were intended to convey complex ideas about cosmology and the structure of reality in a compressed, symbolic form. However, these claims remain speculative and are not supported by empirical verification. Today, the stanzas of Dzyan continue to be studied primarily within the fields of philosophy, religious studies, and the history of esoteric traditions. Their significance lies less in confirmed historical origin and more in their role as a complex and influential symbolic system that has shaped alternative interpretations of cosmology and human origins. Computational matrix. Academic history has long tended to classify difficult or poorly understood texts within familiar frameworks. For many years, the Book of Soyga, also known as Alderaya, a 16th century manuscript associated with John Dee, was described as a typical example of Renaissance occult literature, often dismissed as a collection of mystical or symbolic writings. At first glance, the manuscript appears to be a dense historical text, filled with unfamiliar structures and sequences. For centuries, scholars struggled to interpret certain sections, particularly the large tabular arrangements of letters that seemed, at the time, random or without clear meaning. However, in 1998, cryptographer Jim Reeds conducted a computational analysis of these tables. His work revealed that the sequences were not random. Instead, they followed a consistent and highly structured mathematical pattern, where each element was generated according to specific rules derived from previous entries. What makes this discovery notable is the scale and precision of the system. The tables contain tens of thousands of characters, arranged in a way that suggests a deterministic process. Reproducing such a structure manually, without error, would have been extremely challenging, given the tools available in the 16th century. This has led to ongoing discussion among researchers about how such patterns were constructed. Some suggest that it reflects an advanced form of combinatorial or algorithmic thinking for its time, while others view it as an example of complex symbolic design within Renaissance intellectual traditions. Today, the Book of Soyga is studied as a unique intersection of cryptography, mathematics, and historical scholarship. Rather than being dismissed outright, it is increasingly recognized as a text that raises intriguing questions about early approaches to structured information and encoded systems. DNA Downgrade. Mainstream anthropology and historical scholarship generally interpret the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Maya, as a mythological narrative describing the creation of humanity through symbolic storytelling. It is commonly presented as a cultural and religious epic, reflecting the worldview and traditions of an ancient civilization. However, some alternative interpretations approach the text from a different perspective. In these views, the Popol Vuh is seen not only as mythology, but as a structured narrative that describes multiple stages of human creation in a sequential and detailed manner. At first glance, the text appears to recount how humans were created from different materials: mud, wood, and eventually maize. In conventional interpretations, these stages are symbolic representations of trial and error in mythological storytelling. However, others interpret these descriptions more literally, suggesting they resemble a progression of experimental attempts. Within this framework, the entities described as creators, often referred to as Kukulkan, Tepu, and Guchumats, are viewed not simply as deities, but as figures representing advanced knowledge or creative forces responsible for shaping humanity. The narrative describes early versions of humans that were unstable or incomplete, followed by later versions that functioned more successfully. One of the most notable passages describes the final creation of humans as beings with extraordinary perception and understanding. According to the text, these humans were initially able to see and comprehend everything clearly. However, their perception was later limited, reducing their awareness to a more ordinary level. In academic contexts, this is typically interpreted as a symbolic explanation for human limitations. In alternative readings, it is seen as a narrative describing a deliberate reduction of human capabilities. Today, the Popol Vuh remains an important cultural and historical document. While its meaning continues to be debated, it is widely recognized as a complex and layered text that reflects deep questions about human origins, knowledge, and the nature of consciousness. Wiped race. Mainstream academic history and linguistics generally classify the Oera book as a 19th century creation, often described as a literary hoax or historical curiosity. It is commonly attributed to a Dutch author and interpreted as a fabricated chronicle rather than a genuine ancient source. However, alternative interpretations present a very different view. In these perspectives, the text is seen as a structured narrative that may preserve elements of a much older tradition, possibly reflecting ideas about lost civilizations and forgotten historical frameworks. At first glance, the book appears to be a chronicle of ancient Frisian culture. Yet, one of its most unusual features is its language and writing system. The script does not clearly align with known historical alphabets, and its geometric structure has led some to describe it as highly systematic and internally consistent. The text also contains detailed accounts of large-scale events, including descriptions of natural catastrophes and societal collapse. In conventional scholarship, these passages are interpreted as fictional or symbolic storytelling. In alternative readings, they are viewed as attempts to document major historical or environmental disruptions. Another notable element is the portrayal of a structured society with distinct cultural and social systems, including references to leadership roles and philosophical principles. These descriptions have been interpreted in various ways, ranging from mythological constructs to speculative reconstructions of early societies. Because of its controversial nature, the Oera book has been widely debated since its discovery. While it is largely dismissed within academic circles as a forgery, it continues to attract interest as an unusual and complex text that challenges conventional interpretations of history. Today, it remains a subject of discussion, not because of confirmed authenticity, but because of the questions it raises about how historical narratives are constructed, interpreted, and sometimes disputed.